Hi. Welcome. So I want to talk today about ports, platforms, and arcades, and we'll sort of work up to what I hope will be some open discussion, reminiscing, and analysis together of some particular arcade games, how home ports differed, and also other issues related to porting and adaptation, translation, reworking, remixing, and the wonderful lack of originality that not only in video gaming but in digital media overall, right, we're all blessed with today. But the basic question, really of trying to understand what platforms are and, how they influence creativity, games and other types of digital media production, could start with a question like this. So the game on the left is, people recognize it at all? Pong, right? And the game on the right? Hunt the Wumpus, yes. And so we could just see, even from this little glimpse that we have on the screen, documenting these two, that they seem to be very, very different, right? They're both digital games, they're both computer games, they're both things you talk about in relationship to digital media and computing, and they're influential games, but there are some things that are quite different about them, and some of these are visible in terms of the interface. Hunt the Wumpus is played in print, on a print terminal in many cases, early on. Pong is a cabinet, made to sit somewhere. But it's not just the superficial differences here, but also there's really differences in how these two systems model the world, or the domain in which you're playing, right? Because in Pong you have a continuous plane. You can move your paddle continuously up and down. The ball, moves continuously, and you have instead a discrete playing field in Hunt the Wumpus, which is a dodecahedron. And in fact, this is something that's significant about Hunt the Wumpus, is that it has a regular playing field, but one that isn't a grid, unlike Star Trek, the mainframe game, unlike a lot of earlier games that were played on computers at the time. So one of the things, we might think, well, maybe these come from different historical epochs, like we're uncovering things from different strata of the past. Actually, it's not true, because Pong was done in summer 1972, Gregory Yob, who was a student at UMass Dartmouth, and was working at the People's Computer Company in Menlo Park, made this basic program in 1973 that was Hunt the Wumpus. So they're actually from about the same period of time. What else could be different? Well, maybe that they're made by radically different sorts of people, right? Not exactly. I mean, Al Alcorn was a television engineer. He had been at Berkeley, during riots, and had joined up with Nolan Bushnell to create Pong. But his background really wasn't, radically different than the college student Gregory Yob. Gregory Yob didn't go on into the industry. He became a extropian, and after he died, his head was preserved and is still at the Alcor Life Extension Facility in New Mexico. That's the short biography for Gregory Yob. But at the time, he was a fairly similar guy to Al Alcorn in a lot of ways. And they didn't really, you say, well, maybe these arose sort of out of different cultures. There's something, radically, like we expect Japanese gaming to be different than, games from the US. We expect, those guys in Montreal, they're doing something crazy because they speak French. Maybe there's something else going on here. And actually, if we look at where these were made, they were made within a few miles of each other down in the 101, right? Because in Menlo Park, the People's Computer Company was a site for a storefront where you could come in and program in BASIC. And in Sunnyvale, the first location for Atari, was this sort of garage-like environment in which Al Alcorn put together Pong. So they're not different in that regard. Are they maybe for different sorts of places or audiences? Okay. Well, yes, they are. But they're both actually sort of like, made for public spaces. I mean, one of them wasn't just some guy made this to amuse his friends. they were both made for broader audiences. One for a public computer club with a storefront. People could come in and program and play games. Sort of radical project for the early 1970s. And the other one was for a tavern, Andy Capp's, which is a eating and drinking space in the Bay Area. And importantly, people always talk about that magical moment when Pong is introduced, as if it were the first video game, and it's a bread tray. That Al Alcorn used fills up with quarters, and the machine, they're like, oh, the machine's broken, and he comes and it's all full of quarters. Well, the interesting thing is there's already a coin-op video game there, right? Because actually computer space was installed, in the same place. So it wasn't. I mean, this wasn't like it was obviously very significant and commercially successful and very very influential in the industry, but it wasn't the absolute first video game anyone had ever seen, even in this place. So people had seen basic programs before, they had seen video games. So of all this, I think, to me, the answer as to why these things are different, I mean, there are different factors, including that they're made by different people with different intentions. They have, a different idea of what's fun and, how games should be designed. Yeah, that's certainly part of it. But for me, the most essential aspect, which I think is often overlooked, is just that, they're made of different stuff. The material, right, actually, what is Pong? Here you see the basic code that constitutes Humpty-Wampus, as it's published in 1975 in Creative Computing. Pong actually has no lines of code. It's a circuit. It's an integrated circuit that a television engineer hooked together, probing around to find a good point to connect the sound that would make it sound nice. Right? This is sort of circuit bending mode, and so the means of assembling this was quite different. And then there were sort of different concerns about how it would be manufactured and what would be involved. That it worked with actually a consumer television, so it was cheaper to go buy a TV than it was to get a monitor without a tuner on it at the time. So Al Alcorn just went and bought a TV from a store to fit into the first Pong system. So the sets of concerns there are quite different, and then the types of computing that these systems can do are different because and the types of controls you can hook up to them and so on, right? And so this is what I mean by platform differences. Okay, and I simply want to point to this area for creators of arcade games or of video games of other sorts, and also for critics and theorists, to point out that this level of platform is significant in this regard, and that we can't stay on the level of looking at players, looking at designers, or imagining abstract things about the way games are different without considering that these games are also negotiating with the underlying systems that they're built on. It's just the nature of abstraction, right? The way we manage and bundle complexity is to build platforms that are general purpose to some extent, and then other things can be built upon. But once we build a platform like this, we have to negotiate with that concept of what, in this case, video gaming or computer programming should be. Okay, so now Pong itself was a sort of port, actually, because the Magnavox Odyssey that Ralph Baer had come up with featured a tennis game that was quite similar. It didn't have sound, it didn't have on-screen display of score, and it wasn't situated in an arcade. Okay, so Pong is a case where we have an arcade game that's really a port of a home game. And are there other, or actually even the term arcade game isn't exactly right, because arcades didn't exist when Pong was made. They came about later on. There were pinball halls and so on, but they were placed in laundromats and taverns and so on. What other cases of this can you think of? Where's a case where we actually have a coin-op game that's a port of a game of another sort, video game of another sort?
Yesterday we were talking about Nickelodeon's there's a coin-op movie theater, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So when you look early on in cinematic history, and you find what we assume now is a public spectacle for a group sitting together, so forth. It's quite different. So the main case that I can think of is the one that I already told you about, which is Computer Space by Nolan Bushnell, right? Which is originally a game created at MIT in 1962, Space War.
It was more contemporary when Nintendo did Super Mario Brothers in the arcade. I mean, it came out first, obviously, for the NES, and then it was so successful, they had an arcade variant of it. So I mean, that's kind of more contemporary, but it's kind of the one thing that came to mind was,
So that's
Yeah,
applied
yeah.
to Mario Kart as well. I'm not sure if it was intended for the Wii, but I did see an
Yeah.
arcade version of it.
So the thing about these, that I think that it's it's interesting to look at these and see, you know, what had to be carried across to a new platform. When you make a port, sort of and when I say what has to be, I mean, nothing has to be. You could throw it all away and make a new game if you wanted to. But someone who was programming and designing that and working on it for several months, really in a concentrated way, you know, made some very conscious decisions about what would be in the version that they were making and what would be left out. And so I want to talk about some of these things more specifically with related to stuff we have around. And then of course, you know, there's an earlier version of, this is a side view version of, you know, Tennis for Two by William Higginbotham from the 50s. So, you know, we can keep going back and see that, well, people are porting, you know, existing games, and even this is obviously a version of tennis. It wasn't just made up by the person implementing it. So this is I'm trying to see which. No, this is not the one that You can see the consumer TV inside Pong here. This is the main reason I put this on. But there's a lot of components, like, you know, there's in fact a bread pan that was used to catch quarters. You know, laundromat style devices to indicate if a quarter is dropped. And, you know, pieces like this that are cobbled together. So you'd say that Pong, you know, doesn't exactly have a platform in the sense that, well, we didn't develop a system first and then make a variety of games, one of which was Pong, you know, all for that system. But nevertheless, it is based on these components that are in some ways general purpose. And then Pong is ported for the home, not only for the Atari VCS in Video Olympics here, but also early on in Home Pong, Super Pong, Quadra Pong, these games that are provided that Atari devises as special purpose dedicated devices. So this is another category that obviously is not a cartridge-based or general purpose, you know, video gaming system. It's not neither the Atari VCS nor Steam, right? But it's also not an arcade or coin-operated system. And then Hunt the Wumpus, you know, has an interesting life. It actually becomes a cartridge for the TI 99A computer, and it's published with source code in creative computing. So, you know, we have both, it's something else that's influential in later games, in that, you know, there are a lot of grid games that are provided, and you can see some of the denunciation of the grid here that Greg Riob is writing about. And this sort of opens up the idea that, well, even if we're going to stay regular, we might have other sorts of more interesting playing surfaces. And then, of course, there were games that had irregular playing surfaces, like Adventure by Crowther and Woods, the text adventure providing a simulation of a cave in certain ways. This is, I believe this is the person who does Mommy Blogger, who's using a print terminal to program in Pascal. And so this is the type of terminal that would be very conventional for playing Hunt the Wumpus and early on Adventure. Of course, if you had a fancy video display, you might use that. But you think, what does this device afford you as a way to interact? Well, you know, it doesn't have a means of moving the paddle continuously, but it does have a means of inputting language, which would be very hard on an arcade game, at least if it were more than three initials to indicate your high score. So the idea about, I think, looking at platforms is that it can, I mean, it's not always the you know, the fundamental or essential thing about games, but it can fill in our understanding in really interesting ways. So, you know, these are games that came out about the same time, right? But you know, they're obviously quite different in terms of the levels of violence, number of demons, you know, the activity of the player, and you know, encountering them and things like this, right? And you know, I would say it's significant that this is a 386 game written in assembly, and that this is a game that's written in actually originally a version of HyperCard, SuperCard on the Mac. It's imported to Windows. And I think, you know, the capabilities of those underlying platforms, I mean, you can obviously, you know, as we know from what Bungie has done, right? Macintoshes are capable of doing things like this. It's not an inherent impossibility, but when you look at the affordances of different platforms that you're offered, and what you can do in some of the language video cards that are available, and what you can do with a HyperCard-like system, and what you can build on, then there's some new aspects of these games, I think, that open up. And I think you could even talk about games that actually appear on the same platform, right, in terms of their different platform histories. So, Hexic is something that's related to mobile gaming and to the history of Tetris. It's developed by its creator. And so we can look at the types of tropes in gaming history that it's building on, which might account for some of the reasons that it plays a little bit differently than Halo 3, even though they're both Xbox 360 games. All right, so with that, I want to go quickly through some ideas from platform studies, which is a principled way of making sense of the different layers of digital media and the contributions they have to what people have done with creative production in computing. And I'll mention just briefly then 4 books that deal with platforms, which I have here, and then we'll talk about point-out ports specifically and the arcade. So this is the abstruse theoretical part, but I want to try to explain how it is that all of us who are working to try to understand digital games and other phenomena in digital media are coming at them. How we can slice up the puzzle of this powerful new media form in ways that clarify the things that we're trying to understand. So initially, one of the layers that we can look at when we see any type of digital game, any digital media object, is that level of reception or operation. In other words, people play it. They do something to it. They think about it a certain way. They reflect on it, right? They discuss it. Right? These are questions of reception and operation. And there's been some work here, obviously. It's some significant work. And it's in many ways it's not. Although digital games are different than other types of media, this level of reception operation is common to a lot of media objects. We can talk about film the same way, like how do people watch it? Where do their eyes go when they view it? What meaning do they make out of it? We can do this with a lot of different media. And so these are some of the fields, or subfields, that look into this: reception aesthetics, reader response, psychoanalysis, sort of a study about desensitization to violence. Video games cause violence. That's essentially a reception and operation study. Empirical studies of interaction and play of different sorts, right? Another layer then is, and specifically the layer below this, is concerned with interface, right? So interface is not just what people think or see, but it's how they connect to the machine and how they operate it. And there's interface, in computer science related studies, human-computer interface, HCI, is a field. We can do comparative studies of user interfaces. We might have different ideas about this. We might say, which interfaces are most efficient, or we might say which are most mimetic, which give a feeling of doing some activity that the game is trying to emulate. There would be many different ways to come at it, but whichever ways we're going to do that, we're going to be studying the interface. We can look at visual studies, film theory, art history, and this concept of remediation by Jay Bolter and Richard Grusin, which is considering how it is that earlier, what we think of as historically earlier media phenomena like television, might be influenced by computer interface to put more tickers and information on the screen in a way that looks like a computer screen. So that's this level of interface. Then we think about the level of form and function. Okay, so this is really what a lot of game studies is about. The distinction between that interface level and this level of form and function, for me, is you can choose a 2D or 3D chessboard. You can choose the chess pieces to look however you like. You can type in to move them, or you can click to move them with a mouse. Those are interface concerns. But the question of how the computer plays chess, does it implement the rules of chess properly? And what strategy does it take against you? and even what help does it offer. All of those things are at the level of form and function, right? And you can separate them out. We can, and in fact, chess programs do. You can get a different chess engine and a different chess interface, and you can put them together. Actually, a lot of, one of the things that ludologists and narratologists often will agree about is their concern with this level of form and function here. Because in both cases, we're trying to see how it is that games, stories, and other types of digital media artifacts work. Okay. And then there's a level of code, which is underneath this form and function. And I separate this out because, as we know, we can write different computer programs that do the same thing. Right? We can write them in different programming languages. We can use different types of idioms to write them. We can write them more or less efficiently. We can use comments or not. Right? So this level of code is another level more recently being investigated in code studies and code aesthetics, software studies. But classically, the study of this would be in software engineering, where people are considering things about code in terms of efficiency. How can we get the problem solved with as little complexity as possible, and as few lines of code as possible, and as few loops, and so on. So code is another level, and we imagine we can write a chess program that plays chess identically, but we could write different pieces of code that would actually implement that and make it work. And then the final thing is that there is something underneath code, which is this level of platform. That when we write a program, whether we write for HyperCard on the Mac or 386 assembly, is a question of which platform that we target, right? And this is something, people in the game industry are very concerned about this. Often the concern is to make things as similar as possible across platforms, not to take advantage of the specifics of different platforms and what they can do, but to be able to sell, essentially the same product, something that reviewers will agree is, all of these are pretty good versions, to as many different channels as possible. That's one perspective on platform. People, for instance, work in the demo scene to create, very, very platform-specific effects and showcase those, have a different perspective. Okay, so classically, there's not really much that's been done, in the arts and humanities on this level of platform. Programming language researchers in computer science and people in computer architecture do consider things like platform. We have the scientific side of things, and platform studies is what, along with Ian Bogus, we're working to introduce as a means of understanding this platform level. Now, we don't actually have a single approach to say that you have to come from a material studies of text perspective, or you have to come from an anthropological perspective. You have to do archival research. You have to do interviews. It's more that we want to understand platform as one of the components of digital media that's been left out until now. And the way that these layers are stacked, is to indicate that that really, if in fact what you're looking at is code, if you are studying the way that the code to a game has been written, the way the software development process happened, the actual comments and variable names, and way that source code text is put together, then the things you're going to be most concerned with, that most directly connect to this, are platform and form and function, right? Because the code implements a certain function, and the code is built on a particular platform. And then, yes, that there's an interface up there that someone is ultimately going to be playing, going to be interacting with, right? But that's going to be mediated through the other aspects of this layer cake. So that's the idea of what platform studies is, and I'll show you some examples of what has been done in it so far. So Racing the Beam, I'll hand around a copy of this. It's a book that Ian Bogus and I did as the first platform studies book. And we look, of course, at the Atari VCS, which we're seeing now, and which I'll talk about a bit more later. I'll mention at this point, one of the main insights that I had in writing this book with Ian. When I started this, I didn't put it in a slide, but when I started thinking about this, which was about 10 years ago, I posted on our group blog, Grand Text Auto, I posted a note about what would be an Atari 2600 canon. What are the canonical games for the Atari VCS? Which games do we have to really discuss to understand that system very well? And some people in the humanities are very opposed to the idea of canons, but a canon really is a standard. It means what standard are we going to hold up other games to? What are we going to use as a point of comparison, right? And the objection to a literary canon usually comes from there being long ossified, too well-established canon. But no one had really thought about the games that are most worthy of study in comparison for the Atari VCS at this point. So as I started looking at this, coming up with different ideas, my initial thought was, well, of course we want original games, right? We don't want just some game that was originally. If we're going to study, Pac-Man, we would just go to the arcade version of the game, which is the original game. We wouldn't study the Atari VCS version of Pac-Man, right? Because aside from it, being considered to be crappy and everything, it's also, it's just, it's not the canonical, it's not the original, it's not the most important version of the game. So I started, trying to accumulate some titles that were interesting, and in the process of writing the book, there were really two things that came out that showed me that original view that I had was totally wrong. And the first is that almost everything for the Atari VCS is a port. The whole business model for how Atari operated is, they made arcade games, and in general, more than half of the early games, they just took those arcade games and brought in someone from who's a programmer working on the Atari VCS and said, okay, make a home version of this. And the exceptions to that might be things like basic math, which we would think is probably not a canonical title for the Atari VCS. So that was one problem. That suddenly what I assumed that the brilliant original stuff is going to really shine. But in terms of actually what was made for the console, almost everything was a port. And then the second part though is that ports actually are really interesting. And as I came to look at this, I saw that here's where someone has made a decision about what to leave behind, what to implement, how to adapt things, how to change things, very thoughtfully for this different context and this different platform. And in fact, the ports often tell us more than the so-called original games, if there are any of them. So that's a little insight from that book. One of the things Steve Jones and George Thurivatikal did here with Codename Revolution is they wrote a book about a platform that, at the time this book is published, the Wii is still, being sold. So it's a current platform, and this is something a lot of people had a lot of resistance to the idea that, we need the distance of history, we can't look at anything that's going on right now, we need to look at the past, and which is funny because when we started writing about the Atari VCS, people were like, what's that? Is that even a video game? This is too far in the distant past. So I guess you get those responses no matter what. But they picked up the Wii and started talking about specific things like controllers, like the Wii Fit, and understanding how it is that a system like this, that the Wii Fit actually is certified as a bathroom scale in Japan, and the original concept, part of the development of this device and the way it's used, whether or not it's exactly a game or a game peripheral, it's certainly a piece of digital media. It's certainly using computation in an unusual way. Part of the idea, originally was that it would be in the bathroom, that people would maybe weigh themselves in the bathroom and take a USB stick with the data, or somehow, bring this over to the main room where the Wii, actually was set up. So it became this engagement with, actual spaces in the house and culturally what they meant and what people were willing to do in different spaces and how this would fit in. So that story is some of what's in Codename Revolution. And then Jimmy Maher did this great book, The Future Was Here, on the Commodore Amiga, which is really the first example of a multimedia computer, and it was a tremendous puzzle to computer purchasers and users at the time. What is this for? It must be a game machine because it has graphics, but But it was actually made to provide serious business uses. It has a use with video toaster, media manipulation, and creating facilities that actually predated, of course, those of the Mac. And so one chapter is on the bouncing ball demo and an analysis of how this is done. So this is done by actually changing the palette in the part. And there's also a discussion of some of these images, Amiga animation, and then this. Does anyone know who this is?
Wally?
Yes, this is Debbie Harry. This is Andy Warhol's portrait of Debbie Harry, which he did on the Amiga at the at the launch party for the Amiga. So these issues of the capabilities of the machines and their unusual sorts of cultural engagement, are quite present. And then with a group of 9 others, I wrote a book about this one-line basic computer program. This is the book. Also, please take a bookmark or two. It is available for free as a PDF at tinprint.org. We printed the bookmarks before we put that site up. It's also a real MIT Press book. You can see if you go buy one at the MIT Press bookstore, you can see. That's really its title. The cash register doesn't lie. So.
Once you start to run the code.
Yeah. We should see it running on.
Now I just had this great mental vision of this giant line chasing you out of the MIT Press bookstore.
Yeah. So one of the things that we did in this book, so this is also a book that is a lot about porting, although that might not seem to be a topic that's really essential to understanding this particular program in BASIC. We talk about the basic programming language, about the way mazes relate to computing in the West. We write about the Commodore 64. But one of the things also that we do is to actually port this program to other platforms, and see how it would look. So this is Apple II version of the program. One of the things about the Commodore 64, which we perhaps discovered, or at least something that was really driven home to us by porting it, is that the specific character set, the Petsky character set is sometimes called, of the C64, is really significant in creating that maze effect. So on the Coco, it does not look maze-like particularly at all. On the Apple II, even though the Apple II has perfectly diagonal slashes here, right, they don't connect up, so they don't really make a maze in the same way. And that's an Atari 2600 port, and this is a version that is probably in Perl, something for modern day command line. And so, we're looking at this, and one of the things you can do, because Unicode does have these diagonal line characters, right? You can make a Unicode version of the program in a modern day terminal that looks like the C64. The C64 characters themselves are not in Unicode. Okay, enough about character encodings. I could go on. But the point is that we were using this, we're doing this process to learn about something. So if I would say, if you want to study a game, like, really intensively, particularly something that's older, somewhat simpler type of game, one of the best things you can do is to port that, maybe to more than one platform, and figure out, what about that game you consider essential and what can you bring across in a port. So this is not a port, but a modified version of the program, a variant of the program that's running in my lab, the Trope Tank, over in building 14. Okay. All right. Let me let's get to the actual good arcade stuff now. All right. Oh no, we'll start with that. Yeah. Okay. Let's see here. What do you remember about? How many people have played Space Invaders? Okay. And so all of you played Space Invaders. All of you played Space Invaders on an arcade cabinet.
No.
Were you answering this? Yeah. So we have to. One of the things we have to understand when we talk about point-out games and arcade games is the autographic and allographic distinction, and which side of that we come down on. So when you ask someone, you say like, how many people here have seen the Mona Lisa? Okay. Now, everyone who raised their hand, like, actually went to the Louvre and saw the Mona Lisa there? Yeah. Of course. Yeah. Because you didn't, it's not like, oh yeah, you saw it in a book. Like, you know, you wouldn't say that, right? It's something where you have to, I actually have to apprehend it. On the other hand, if I said, like, how many people, you know, read Hamlet, or how many people read Frankenstein? Frankenstein's a better example, because there is actually a manuscript of it. There's no manuscript for Hamlet, so we can't read Hamlet, you know, in the same way. But, you know, no one thinks that, like, you actually have to read Mary Shelley's, you know, longhand version of Frankenstein in order to have read it, right? I mean, you'd say I read it in manuscript, you know, something like that. So the reason I bring this up is because it's a question. You know, when I say, have you played Space Invaders? Like, well, I played Space Invaders Extreme on my DS. Like, does that count? You know, do you consider that to be playing Space Invaders? Do you consider the Atari VCS version to be Space Invaders? Right? So these are questions that might have ramifications for you as a game designer, deciding what to make and how and where. All right, so Space Invaders. Space Invaders coin op. What should we say about it? What do we recall from our experiences? Space Invaders. Is there anything about
The sound, the
Okay.
beep.
sound? Okay.
That speeds up when they get closer to the ground.
Sounds.
Oh yeah, no, that
right?
Futurama episode where the continue to move faster.
Yeah. Okay.
To the left. Faster.
The saucer at the top.
Okay. Saucer. Okay.
The destructible, the breakable rocks that are protectors.
Okay. So the shields are. I'll intervene by changing the terminology here too, but we're talking about the same thing.
You can only shoot up.
Okay.
But like a
Move left and right.
Okay. So only left and right. So in fact, what control is it? What's the control? Okay. It's a one-directional joystick, but that wasn't obvious. That wasn't something I remembered. Okay. What else?
the bug-like aliens. Alien. I mean,
Yeah, you remember visually what the aliens look
it's
like.
only
right?
aliens because they're space invaders and not sea invaders.
Right. Okay. What about the display?
Oh yeah, everything's white except for the shields of green.
Okay. So it's sort of two-color, white, green.
And I remember the green's actually an overlay.
Ah.
It's not a color display.
Yeah. So we'll talk about what overlays are. That might be something interesting to people wanting to design arcade games, even though probably wouldn't think of them as strictly necessary these days. But so, what about? Is there like a background? Is it
Solid black, if I recall.
solid black? Okay.
I don't think there were stars or anything.
Okay.
I don't recall that. Any stars.
Now I actually can't remember if I'm remembering between the 2600 version and the co-op version, because my memory of the shields is that they were orange, not green.
Okay.
But that might be
Yeah.
the 2600 instead.
Green, maybe orange.
Okay. So, anything else to say? I don't know.
And the movement of the
Right. So
aliens.
the whole armada of
Yeah,
aliens, right, moves back and forth.
But they don't quite move in sync. They kind of
Okay.
they kind of all take turns shifting very rapidly.
All right.
Again, maybe that was an emulated version or a ported version.
Well, let's take a look at the video. So one of the things, right? I love myself and with classes and and talks doing exercises like this, because this is another way, like making a port, right? That we can say like what things are most memorable, like the things everybody agrees on, the sound, like everyone remembers the sound from Space Invaders right away, and then there's things that we sort of can't quite remember. Doesn't mean that their effect isn't significant, or that we might not want to carry that effect over if we were making a port. But it tells us something about our own reception and our own understanding of the game and our memory of it. And that's one thing also that, we can look up stuff on the internet, but if we want to know, like, what is our memory, like our collective memory of Space Invaders, right? We're the authorities on that. We can't actually find that information out online. We have to ask ourselves by doing some type of exercise like this. All right. So let's see what we have here.
Oh, the cabinet art.
Yeah. Let's see if, hold on a second. I probably don't have this. Yeah, so. All right. So, indeed, right, what we have, there's an overlay, so there's a gel, there's a color gel that's green that is on the bottom of this monochrome monitor, right? What's going on with this? There's a large satellite of some sort.
It's how we know you're in space.
Yeah, and so this is definitely one of the things that should make it clear that you're in space, right? So what's happened is, right, the monitor that is displaying this is set horizontally, and it's displaying a reverse image, and you have a mirror at 45 degrees, right? That is not entirely silver, right? So you see a reflection of the image back there, and you see the background behind. So this is, let's see here. This is probably a main emulator. So this is sort of interesting, I think. Let's take a look at it in relationship to Rick Mauer's Atari 2600 port. Let's see here, which is supposed to be one of these. It's probably the last one. And here's the box, right? So so obviously, like, the cabinet art is something that you don't have in the home version, but the box is something that you don't have in the point-out version. So that's not the original box there. Let's see here.
Actually, could you take the chair on the right side?
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that's important to remember this game is it wasn't until Yar's Revenge that pushing the button to start the game was invented. You have to use the game reset button. So, there we go. Let's see here. Let's see here. I'm gonna have to get a.
Let's swap controllers.
Well, yeah, the controller is working, but the game reset switch is not.
Should I switch consoles?
Yeah, we can do that. Let's see here. There we go. Okay. So, if I'm going to play, then you need to start talking. So, just tell me some things you notice in terms of differences, similarities. We do have orange shields, it looks like. In fact, we've got a few different colors going here that we didn't have in the original. But it's not very multicolor, right?
Computer shields.
Okay.
Starting a lot closer to you.
Yeah, you're sort of. Yeah, there's less screen real estate on the 2600 version, I think.
There's only 6 across.
Yeah, fewer. So there's fewer Space Invaders.
Seems like your ship's much bigger too.
I feel like the aliens just like uniform.
Oh, I can fix that. Let's see. There we go. So that's the handicap switch. So I just made the ship smaller by flipping it. One of the things here's a curiosity of the VCS, right? So you can switch those handicap switches, and on this model, this is a 4-switch VCS. On this model, you could, people can't very easily see what position they're in. So you can switch those switches and put them into put your opponent into like the harder mode without the opponent knowing. However, in Space Invaders, it's pretty obvious that.
Yeah.
Is that it? Yeah. That's it.
The stars disappeared for a second and then came back, right? Or at least the numbers on top.
Yeah, so we have this amazing 8-digit score display, six sprites across. So we mentioned the shields are in orange, but right, to be precise, they're either in orange or not, because the Atari VCS has a color black and white switch, so that if you have a black and white television, you want to hook it up to that TV and still be able to see everything on it. All these games have a color black and white mode. But all that's happening when you switch between color and black and white is just that, there's a bit that's set differently that the program can read. Each of the individual games have to implement color and black and white, in order to actually make them work.
Can you shoot the missiles in the 2600 version?
It might. So there's actually 117 different game variants. So it's quite possible that you can in some of them. One of the most remarkable variants, I think, is, let me get the other PCS stuff. So I'm gonna switch in this Atari 2600 Junior, which is the last sort of commercial model of the Atari VCS. Does that look like it should? That might be worse. Let's see.
There you go.
There we go. Okay. I was having some trouble with the switches here, but we should be able to move along. So this is also, there's different models of the same system. They're hardware compatible. But this is something that has continued. Obviously, the current version of the PS3 that's being manufactured is not identical to the first version. Even when the overall form of the unit doesn't change, companies are looking to maximize efficiency and reduce the number of chips and so on. Let's see if I can. Oh, the Space Invaders does have a special mode where if you hold down select and reset, I think. Let's see here. Unfortunately, I can't see what I'm doing very well, but oh yeah, I'm going very rapidly, aren't I? That's good. Okay, so. You needed a way to go through the very large number of versions there.
Invisible?
Yeah, so this is it's invisible, and this is something also, you go back to the original Atari VCS, really, the first game, the game that was bundled with the system, Combat, you also have invisible tanks. So one of the things you can do is just, turn off the display of the sprite while still doing collision detection. And so that can be used again and again to make invisible opponents of this sort. But the thing that I find really fascinating about this is that we have, let's see here. There we go. We have a two-player mode. So I'm not going to play against invisible opponents very well with two players, but to demonstrate, right, you have a two-player cooperative mode, and this is something that obviously you could do it in the arcade. I mean, you could make an arcade machine where people play cooperatively together, and people have done it. But you're invited to do it in a certain sense with the Atari VCS because people are normally going to have two joysticks plugged in, and they're normally going to be playing either competitive or cooperative games of this sort. So the cost to coding, this extra player is relatively small, and in fact, you don't need to build on to the cabinet and add different controls and so on. Let's take a look at some of the other Atari VCS games, and I'll tell you some about them. These are some of the games that we looked at in the book. This is Combat. Probably looks recognizable if you have familiarity with the Atari VCS at all. And Combat is more or less a port. It's a version of Tank, this arcade game. Tank was really the other big, very, very early coin-op hit, along with Pong. And it was manufactured and sold supposedly by Key Games. So Joe Key was Nolan Bushnell's neighbor, and he basically just set up a fake company with him as the president and distributed this. And part of this actually gets into, these are sort of more social and cultural issues related to platform rather than technical ones. But the way that these were distributed, is through distributors that did pinball machines, and there were certain issues with exclusivity and having one company, produce all the games of this sort. There are also issues, related to, I don't know if people have been I was surprised to find 10 or 15 years ago, back when there were still arcades in Montreal, that you couldn't go in unless you were 18 years or older. And in New York City, Fiorello LaGuardia, after whom the airport is named, when he was mayor, he banned pinball machines and would go around smashing them to bits to salvage their metal for the war effort. And the reason some of these things come about, to some extent people say, oh, well, it's because the people were betting on pinball machines that are used in gambling. But they're also used to launder money because, and in fact, the phrase launder money comes from another small change business, the laundromat, where you can't really tell, it's very difficult to audit the laundromat and see how many people are washing their clothes. You'd have to park someone outside and watch everyone who goes in. And as a result, if you need to hide some illegal gains somewhere, you can just say, oh, well, it came in through the laundromat or it came in through the arcade. And these are all features that were relevant to the way arcade games were set up and when someone would need to put a fake company like this together. Tank did not have the airplane. Let's see here. Any of the jet plane games? Am I there yet?
So, there's like a billion variations of the Tank things.
There's 27 overall here. Let's see. Yeah. There we go. So this was added in to Combat, but essentially it starts off as a version of Tank, and the way that these plane versions come is, well, the planes always have a constant velocity. They can be slow, they can slow down or speed up, but they have a velocity, but the mechanics for they also wrap around the screen, which the tanks don't do, right? But that's simply done by including or omitting just a one large background pixel all the way around. So with a few variations here, you're able to make a new game. And this is actually one of the things that's quite significant in the Atari VCS. Normally we don't think of cartridges as having a lot of games, but Combat is advertised as 27 video games, 117 for Space Invaders, 50 for Video Olympics, right? So one of the things about having a console, a system that looked like a stereo component with its wood grain and everything, was that you would have, you'd be able to play a variety of games, but even when you bought one cartridge, right, it might have a lot of different options for you to play with. And that didn't make the same sort of sense in the arcade because people wanted to be able to identify the game that they were going to and go up to it and play it. So we also have Adventure. Now this is really one of the more original games for the Atari VCS. Warren Robinett did this game. There's a game called Superman, which actually came out earlier using some of the code from it. But here in Adventure we have the famous dot, and objects to pick up, an ability to walk around. Okay, and this is something that it looks very, very ordinary to us, the way in which space works in this game. But the Atari VCS, remember that we were talking about like Pong, Tank, and generally games where everything took place on the same screen, right? There wasn't a world, there wasn't a simulated game world that was larger than the screen until on the Atari VCS, Adventure. And figuring out how to, the Atari VCS is built to where it naturally wraps around. When this character goes off the top, the part where that sprite appears, that 1 pixel ball sprite appears on the bottom, right, is pretty much built in to the Atari VCS. But the idea of drawing a new world rather than having your asteroid ship like appear is quite different. So, but even Adventure, Adventure is a pretty radical game in a lot of ways. But Warren Robinett himself said he was thinking of it as a port of Crowther and Wood's classic game Adventure or Colossal Cave. Right? Now it doesn't bear a very close resemblance, but for one thing, the treatment of space is very different visually in Robinett's Adventure and in Will Crowther's Adventure, which owes more to Hunt the Wumpus, probably. But he was trying to think of what were the essential actions that you could do in Adventure that were really important to carry over into a game like this. So, for instance, you had to be able to pick stuff up. Right? I mean, that was just you couldn't have an adventure game unless you can pick up objects. Here you can also drop objects. You can attack, if you're holding a weapon, you can attack another creature with it. Right? And you can explore, the fact that the space is larger than the screen is also significant. You can explore that space, you can move around in it. You can unlock gates and doors, okay? So you look at these things of, what is it that you can do? Can you put water into a bottle? No, you can't do that. I mean, that's something you can do in Crowther and Wood's Adventure, but you can't do here. You can't use language, of course, to interact, but he's tried to bring across what he sees as the essential actions. And I think Crowther and Wood's, to look at Crowther and Wood's Adventure in comparison to this, right, helps us understand why these features are there. They didn't just come from nowhere; they came from a specific background. Okay. There's Pac-Man, or I guess Puck-Man, if we want to go back to the Japanese original, which wasn't brought to the United States because it was too easy to deface the cabinet and make it say something I've seen. So Pac-Man is a pretty important Atari VCS game. It is quite reviled by a lot of people. Let's see if I can. And let's see here. So let me ask this as I start this up. What are some of the challenges and differences from the arcade Pac-Man to here? What do you see as different in this game?
It sounds pretty awful. That's one difference. I mean, it's not something that you see, but something that.
I think moving the 4 ghosts independently through the maze was probably pretty challenging from a recovery point of view.
Yes, extremely so. I mean, there's only 2 sprites because games like Pong and Tank were the model for what the system was going to do.
It's actually even worse than I remember as a kid.
Flickering is just bizarre.
Here, let me actually let me invite someone to come up and play this. We'll make the rest of it. Okay.
Someone else want to give a shot?
And
Go ahead.
okay. So let's talk about differences from I didn't show you video of Pac-Man play and so forth, but let's talk about some of the differences between the home version by Todd Fry and what Midway distributed in the U.S. originally Namco, by Pac-Man. Oh, to start it, we'll just do. I need a quick reset. There it is. What are some differences?
On the maze
Try
layout,
the other one.
I'm confused.
It's probably the other one.
Oh,
Yeah. Here, you want to?
oh, there we go.
Okay.
yeah, the maze layout's completely different.
Okay. Maze layout.
There's no wraparound.
Oh, wait, no.
There's an up-down wraparound door.
Yeah.
There is. Yeah.
Oh, I'm supposed to go eat them now.
Yeah.
No, I'm not.
Okay. So maze layout.
If I remember right, when you hit direction, didn't Pac-Man continue to go in that direction until you...
Yeah, so I mean, the joystick is right. The joystick is different. Like the Atari VCS joystick is quite different, and the way that the joystick control is used, because it was a ball joystick. So I'll give you a hint related to the maze layout and why it has to be different. Yeah, there's a different actual orientation of the screen, right? So.
The dots aren't dots.
And this is something, right? If you're making an arcade game, you can turn the monitor any way you like. If you're selling somebody a cartridge to take for their home system and use in their living room, good luck on persuading them to turn their. If you're damaging Tank, you can do it. But good luck on persuading them to turn their monitor.
In some
90
cases,
degrees.
it could actually be a fire hazard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it could be. I mean, if it's not ventilated properly in that way. So, yeah. There would certainly be liability associated with it. So this is just one of the things. Like you need to think if you're making a home game, right? There are certain issues that, for instance, when the Atari VCS was in development, one of the things that happened is Alcorn went to make a deal with Sears, that did the telegames system and in games that were just their branding for the Atari VCS. They went up to the top of the Sears Tower to do this demonstration, and so Al Alcorn was getting it ready. It's like, oh, wait a moment. So it turns out the system is set to broadcast on channel 2. It's using this RF wire, that plugs into the TV. But at the top of the Sears Tower are antennas that are broadcasting on channel 2. So he couldn't do it. They're actually getting drowned out. And so he rapidly rewired it to channel 3 and made the system, able to work in time for the demo, and it was successful. And Sears funded Atari, and et cetera. But that's the reason that all of these devices have a channel 2, channel 3,
3-4.
3-4. On this one, it's 2-3 actually.
Huh.
But 3-4 is I think on these two it's 2-3, but it is 3-4 on home computers that I know of. So basically, you can point to that specific device, arising from this one particular incident. And there wasn't, early on, right? Now you think, well, we have to comply with FCC regulations about these devices, hooking them up to televisions. The types of things you can hook up to televisions. But what were the types of things you could hook up to televisions in 1977?
20 years.
There were none. There were antennas. That was it. I mean, you could connect an antenna, but you know there weren't VCRs, right? So devices like this come about, and it's just like they're Pong not going into the arcade when it's first made. There's no arcades. We have to actually first of all see how people use coin ops, and they have to decide that it makes sense to aggregate them together and have a play space and so on. And so that's something else that's important to realize about these is to think about them in context, not as a way of forgiving some failure of something like this, but as a way of understanding how things came about and how they fit together.
Should I still be playing?
Yeah, sure. You're like, so what are some other Pac-Man differences?
Someone mentioned they're not actually dots.
Yeah, they're not dots, they're hyphens.
Okay.
Are there any fruit in it?
Oh, yeah.
That's right.
Are the glowing dots, right? Because that's where you get extra points.
So those are power pills,
Come back.
which are fairly similar. Power pills are square.
Square.
No.
The colors are all different.
The ghosts aren't colored. There's no color. There's the coaster. What's that?
Monsters versus Ghosts.
That's right. Monsters versus ghosts, because the term ghosts is introduced with the Atari VCS version. Exactly. Yeah. So they're monsters originally that have 4 different colors. They're also introduced by name in the arcade game, right? We actually see, like we learned, it's almost as if they have personalities.
No intermissions. No intermissions.
Right. So no cut, and it's actually pretty remarkable, right? There are cutscenes in Pac-Man, right? The early instance, probably not the first, but a very early instance of these. So no intro or track. Well, there's sort of an attract mode. There's some color cycling. You get that type of attract mode in all of the, like Combat has that type of attract mode where it cycles the colors. But it doesn't really have an attract mode or cutscenes.
There's no leaderboard.
That's right. The high score is retained though.
Yeah.
Right, which is also, I mean.
Is it kept on the right? Is it kept on the
It's actually also, notice the,
Power off.
The bottom one?
yeah, how would you get, 529? Oh, that sounds great. 529. Is that a good Pac-Man score? Let's see. Boy. Shoot.
We need more in your search bar.
Oops. Oh, I can get the spell versions here. Okay. This is.
Hey guys, Sony for Stuff here with a review on my Pac-Man machine.
Okay.
This is an all-original arcade machine I've had in my family for a long time. You guys seen the Super NES game collection? You guys know I like vintage tech games. And this machine is no exception. It says copyright 1980 and
Free. Oh, hold on. I want to say something about where it says free play. Okay. So, how about like when you make an arcade game, which you're going to do, right? Some of you, right? So how about you just charge money for people to play it, right? You could do that, right? Except you have to have a license, actually. There's probably an amusement. Actually, Steve Golson will be the one to ask about that tomorrow. One of the inventors of Miss Pac-Man, who started putting arcade machines here at MIT when he was a student. The question of whether to have free play or not, right, is something like you can charge money, but it's interesting that when you make a coin-operated machine, that then you're again perhaps related to some of the issues I was talking about, related to small change businesses like laundromats and pinball arcades and things like this. You're in a realm of regulation, and may not be allowed to charge.
Oh wow, you move fast. I don't want to move fast. fast.
Okay. Oh, I think you get your score already too. So one of the things is
That's
that.
how I really suck at that.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So yeah, you can see this
It was in the
22,
25,000.
yeah, 25,000. Okay, so one of the things is actually you can play Pac-Man, for equally long and have like, maybe 1/50th the score on the home version because there's not enough digits to display the high Pac-Man score, right? So they just scale it down, they trim the score down, but then it becomes a little bit disheartening maybe that your score is so low compared to the arcade game. So I'll put that as one of the issues also, that the score actually has changed.
The
What
shape
else?
of Pac-Man is different too. He's kind of
Okay.
he's grabbing dots rather than being like a diagonal eating them.
All right. Pac-Man shape. What else?
In the home, in the Atari version, the Pac-Man only face left or right.
Okay.
Yeah. I
Okay.
don't know why.
Only left and right. Okay. So, does this version have redeeming qualities? I don't know. Because someone, let me ask someone else to come up and give it a try. I think it's pretty playable, and I think one of the things we sometimes do at the Trope Tank is we play versions of Pac-Man for like Apple II on an analog joystick, which is extremely painful, monochrome. It's very bad. We look at Casey Munchkin, which is an interesting game. It's the first game that was pulled from the shelves for infringing, on Pac-Man. Nowadays, you look at it, it does not look at all like Pac-Man. You're like, oh yeah, there's a maze, I think, but there's only 16 dots. There's doors that open and close. It looks completely different. But it was actually held to be so close that it was taken off the shelves. So, but this version, particularly if you try some of the other things that have been called Pac-Man, actually I think it's pretty reasonable. Does someone want to come give it a try? I'm not selling it.
I really like the sound. Like I had this
Yeah.
as a kid. And
It does have this very sound, sort of like a. Here I go. It's this. Yeah. It has this. Maybe it's just my own childhood experience, but I find that it's something like you can really get into a groove. You can play this game for a long time, and it can still be interesting. It's not completely mindlessly. It's challenging in certain ways. You have to be attentive.
But I forgot how mushy the controllers were.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, the ghost. We didn't talk about the ghost flicker, right?
Yeah.
That's sort of included in. They're drawn on 4 alternating frames, each of the 4 ghosts. So now, the thing is, I don't think it looks that bad on a CRT television. I think it looks worse on a flat panel. Oops.
Did this cart have multiple
Yeah,
versions of the single?
I believe so, but it doesn't say in the label. I have to look it up. The other thing is there's certain, again, to understand where this game came from is done in about 5 or 6 weeks by a programmer at Atari in trying to make the Christmas season. It was imperative that this.
The hitbox is really unfair too.
Yeah.
It's still on kind of top.
Yeah, that alley is really long.
don't think.
I don't think there were other versions.
I don't think there are other versions now. Let's see here.
Oh, come on. No victory music? You go to the next map and it's just like, okay, here's a map.
Yeah.
And but yes, score does seem kind of low.
Yeah. So, let's, I'm not sure, I have a little time left, so I'll just mention a few other games that I think are interesting and relate to this issue of ports. I mean, one, I'm not even going to start this up, but I'll just put on the screen, Asteroids. Asteroids has a vector graphics display in the arcade, of course. It uses a fundamentally different hardware display technology, you know, much like Flash versus Director, but in hardware. And so this, you see the version of it here, this is the first 8K cartridge that Atari did. Earlier cartridges are originally 2 and then 4K.
I'm wondering, the asteroids, they don't look like they're flickering as much as the ghosts, yet they still
That's
have
right.
4 of them on screen.
Yes, that's because they are not moving entirely independently the way that the ghosts are, most likely. Yeah. But it is interesting to see, you know, one of the choices that's made here is, well, first of all, you can see you've got color, so, you know, the asteroids are in color. And then also they're solid. On the, you know, vector graphics display, you work by drawing lines, and you can't fill things in, but you can do that with a bitmap, graphics, you know, as easily as not. So since they're supposed to be, you know, massive threatening rocks, why not make them solid? Right? But there's more to say about, you know, the way that one of the things sometimes people one strategy or tactic that people get from this is here what's happening is the asteroids actually, because of the raster display of the TV and the way the VCS is set up, they're moving up and down with a slight left to right displacement. So if you actually sit in the middle of the screen, you can pick them off fairly easily. So, and then I would invite you to go try that on an Asteroids arcade machine and see, see what I mean, there's still some advantage to sitting in the middle of the screen in terms of what you can perceive, but it doesn't help you in the same way. So this is a case where these differences between display systems actually does affect gameplay, you know, pretty concretely. Another one is Yar's Revenge. Yar's Revenge, which does have a push to start, is let's see.
Yeah, when I read the Race of the Beat book, I think I read it a number of years ago, I remember how the field was generated. It wasn't actually generated from the code itself.
Yeah, the code is actually, I mean, Howard Scott Warshaw, he didn't think of it as a great accomplishment. It's just, you know, sort of the obvious thing to do when you need a random looking pattern was you could either, there are basically two options. You could write a, you know, pseudo-random number generator like a polynomial counter, but that would have to, then it would have to run and it would take up space. Or you could just store a random looking pattern, you know, in ROM, and then you could display it. So well, that would be a good idea, but then you have to store the pattern. But what if you had a pattern that was already pretty random looking, such as the game's code itself, right? So that's what's just being used here, and the cover of the book is the neutral zone from Yar's Revenge. So this is a game that started off as a version of Star Castle, which they got the license to. Star Castle is also a vector graphics game. It uses a series of gels, a series of overlays to color the central region, and it's very radially oriented. When Howard Scott Warshaw started working on this, he said, you know, I could just make a much better game if I didn't try to make it exactly like Star Castle. I just, you know, align it with the things that the Atari VCS can do well, and it would be fun, and it would be good. We'll just call it something else, which was an absolutely outrageous idea if you, I mean, think about how businesses work. in the world. Someone says, oh yeah, we bought a license and we want to create this licensed product, and you come up here like, oh yeah, just throw that away and do my own thing instead. Right? But actually, the manager at Atari he was working with said, yes, we'll do that, and they created the best-selling original game. But even this original game is still derived from Star Castle. So what happened just last year was that Scott Williamson at Atari, who was an Atari employee, had read Racing the Beam and said, oh, you know, that's interesting. Star Castle, you know, you can't do a good port of Star Castle for the Atari VCS? I don't think so. So he actually created a port of Star Castle just recently, which actually has all of the radial. It's pretty hard, but it has all the. It also has flashing lights in the cartridge. That's another thing you can do. That's yeah. But this is you know the essential mechanism of Star Castle.
There was something about Yard's Revenge though, that multicolored neutral zone made it stand out.
Oh yeah, it's very. I think it's quite compelling, and it's also a game it's one of the things that's fun to do if you have the chance. How many people have played Yard's Revenge? So, okay, so one of the things that's great to do and could be done in fact by people in the next phase of class if you wanted to is come play it and just without being told what the rules are or reading the manual, you know. Figure it out and then explain it to someone else. Because it's actually it's quite a good game, but it's really quite elaborate also, and it's interesting to do
Did that
that.
outspell Pitfall? Yard's Revenge?
Well, that's a good question. They weren't by the same company because
Right.
Pitfall was Activision.
Sure.
They did. I know that there was. One of the ways you could tell the Yard's Revenge was extremely successful was that there was at least some discussion of making an arcade game based on Yard's Revenge, which you know had never been done. Nothing like that had ever been done at Atari. It didn't happen, but the fact that people were thinking about it, you know, was pretty remarkable. All right, so I think that's past the end of my time. Thanks for your patience, and I hope that some of this was interesting. I would just, you know, want to invite you to think about, as you look at games, analyze games, figure out what's interesting to you about them and how they work, how they fit together, to use the understanding of ports as part of that process. And as you make games, think about porting as a way of exploring existing games, converting and relating to other games. I mean, there's other, you can do literal translation. One of the games that we cover is The Empire Strikes Back, Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back, which is not a port of anything. It's the first Star Wars video game, but obviously it's based directly on incidents in a film, right? So there's another, Parker Brothers, in fact, they only did licensed games, no original games. Strawberry Shortcake and Star Wars and other properties. All right. Thanks so much.